the goal of today is to chat through some work the Metalwork team have been looking at, and also then effectively the interpretation of that by what we think actually might be possible in the short or long term at Makespace. We've got a presentation to guide the discussion, but obviously this is a chance to get everyone on the same page. A load of people have been thinking about this a lot. Some people perhaps haven't been thinking about it or are new to this. So it'd be really good to get everyone up to speed on sort of what we're thinking, where we're at, and fundamentally what's going to happen next, because it will take a bit of effort to do the next phase, but obviously that's the exciting bit of, you know, choosing details and kicking some stuff out. But it's also a chance to put it in context of what might be possible now and what might be possible in the future. So basically, this is trying to summarize, or this is my interpretation of summarizing a lot of the work that the team in the Metalwork team have been looking at. And who is that people? Well, we'll show that first. So the things we're going to cover is a survey. I just want to bring people up to speed about where this started. Some of the space allocation options. So this is sort of my interpretation of what the Metalwork team have done. Then in interpreting that with also some thinking of the other board members and what we know might be possible now in the future about what actually are the constraints that we might have to work with. Then Mark can perhaps talk through some of the equipment capabilities that people have been looking at and trying to understand what that enables. And then we've basically got some proposals and how to make it happen. And obviously shout anytime if you want to add some information or ask a question or whatever. The goal is to get everyone up to the sort of same speed and a sort of shared understanding, right? That fundamentally that's it. We're going to make a lot better progress going forward if everyone's got a basic shared understanding of what we know, what we're thinking now. So to start with the survey, so this actually feels like a long time ago because it was. COVID sort of happened and that perhaps delayed some things here, but I put out a survey based on general metalwork murmurings to try and understand, is there actually interest? And we actually got quite a few responses. At the time, I think I put it out for a week and we got about 50 responses, which is really quite high for a survey. And I think it's 65 now. I thought this was interesting. So I think I put it on the mail group and Twitter and stuff like that. But basically, you know, most people were existing members, 80%, not a surprise because that's who we advertised it to fundamentally. But actually, there was also some others that, you know, 10% was they weren't a member, they weren't planning to become a member, but if Metalwork was available, they would become a member. Okay, that's quite interesting. And remember, this is out of 65 people. Okay, so it's not huge numbers, but it is real numbers. And about 10% were saying, well, I was going to become a member in it anyway, and this would make it better. And in some sense, I don't know how much we should read into that. It's not a big deal. But perhaps what is interesting is thinking about, well, how many people did we actually reach who weren't already members? Is this an indication of the, you know, unmet demand of people that, you know, would want to also come and use our things? And there's two reasons why it's interesting for new people to come in. One is obviously it grows the membership, but it brings in new skills. And that's really interesting that we get new cross sections of skills, new people sharing ideas. So that's really cool. And if this is a new set of people that we haven't been able to serve before, or this is the motivating reason, like a lot of people come for the 3D printers, but then end up doing lots of other stuff. You know, if this is the motivation for them to come in the first place, but then they discover all the other things, that's really interesting. Okay, so that was that. And then the other two, so I'm not going into what the equipment they wanted, that's what the team have been looking at, but I thought this was interesting, that we basically said, it takes a lot of work to put in place a lot of these things. So we actually, for when we started Makespace, we had 50 members who paid up front to help kit out the place. And without that, it wouldn't have happened, right? So it is important to understand if there's meaningful effort to make these things happen. So actually, you know, 10% said no, fair enough. Didn't dive into reasons. A bunch of people said, yes, I could offer a bit of help. And a smaller percentage said, yes, I could offer a lot of help. But it was still a meaningful number. And actually the ones that I could offer a lot of help was the group that I emailed originally and said, hey, you know, we want to take this further. can you among yourselves form a group to go and look at that? So a percentage of that 20% is actually the group that went and looked at it. So now's the time to sort of widen it back out, I think, given that first research has been done, and again give people an option to get engaged, especially as things have changed, right? COVID has changed a lot of people's working situations as well, things like that. So worth looking at that again. But yeah, lots of offers of help, which is great. Whether it transpires is a different question, but it's looking really good. And the other thing is obviously once you kit out this stuff, how much would people be willing to do training? And this one shocked me actually. A lot of people said they would do training. So I don't know how much this would transpire to reality. I think we have to be a little bit skeptical of some of these numbers. But if the intention is there, that's great. One thing that this doesn't reflect is necessarily how skilled the people were. So for those that look through the details of the survey, so this is basically saying what 3/4 of those people would actually do training, which is amazing. But actually quite a high percentage of those people tick the box that said, I would need to learn before I could do the training, which is not a problem. That's kind of Makespace ethos. But it was also an indication of the percentage of people that perhaps have those skills already and would be bringing them immediately into the space versus those that are willing to learn. So worth considering. Anyway, that was the thing that kicked it off. As I said, about 20% of the respondents, so I think it was about 50 people at the time, so just under probably about 15 people said I'd put in a bunch of time, and those were the people I emailed and said, hey, can you start looking at this? And yeah, lots of things have got in the way, so it's been a bit slower than perhaps we would have imagined, but I think we've still made good progress. This is a little bit backwards to what actually happened, but this is now just to give everyone the context of what I think space allocation is possible, because this really does frame the reality of what we can do. Fundamentally, Makespace is the space, and then we fill it with stuff. So objective number 1 is have a space. Objective number 2 is fill it with good stuff. So these are based on sort of back referencing all the research the team did. This is what using the knowledge of the location and what might actually play out over the next 10 years and things like that. This is my summary of what I think the constraints are that we should be working with, and they're rough rules of thumb, but it's just so everyone's got a feel for the kind of ways of thinking about our constraints. They're packaged basically a bit like the proposal that the Metalwork group put together, but just framed from a different angle. And basically there's a small, medium, large option. Small is kind of work with what we've got, squeeze it in, add bits. It was characterized as 0 square meters. It's not really the truth, but it's the sentiment. And it's on the current site, obviously. And it's a fundamentally, what incrementally can we do to up the capabilities for Metalwork? And it transpires actually quite a lot from what people have said. So that's really interesting to understand. So, what the incremental changes that don't have huge disruptive impact that could actually open up lots of things. To be clear, this doesn't add welding. Welding needs approval in our building, which we don't have at the moment, and it needs sensible space, which obviously 0 square meters doesn't give us. So it doesn't add that feature, but it can be done now. It's something that's totally in our control, and we can go and do it. So that's kind of like the small option, and then we can discuss what actually small could look like. That's more Mark and everyone will discuss. But from, I guess, almost like the board's perspective, this is the small option, the constraints that we would put here. So it can be done now. It wouldn't include welding. It would basically not be disruptive, but there's probably a little bit of wiggle room to moving equipment around a bit and stuff like that. The second viable, so to put this in perspective, we were considering other things like, should we get a new site? Should we get a satellite site that we could build this in? What other things can we do? So this is having narrowed a lot of those options down. The medium option is basically saying, well, what if we allocated a decent amount of space at our current site to metalworking? So this might come through reallocation of the space we've got. So 60 square meters, just so for people's reference, is about the size of the current wood and metal shop workshop. That's about what 60 square meters is, just to get so you've got it in your head. So this might be possible either by reallocating space in Makespace as it stands in the space we have, by sacrificing the classroom or moving other stuff around, or things like that. There's different options there. Needs more thought, obviously, but that is a possibility. And another possibility I'm exploring at the moment is, can we actually expand on that current site? So with COVID, it's a little bit harder to have these discussions at the moment, but I've made reasonable progress exploring what might be plausible, and now I'm going to be looking at what might be possible to actually do that. So this one is definitely the current site. We've kind of written off doing a satellite site, and it could be about reallocation, or it could be about expansion on the site. Don't know yet. So it's not an immediate thing we could do, but one we should seriously consider. With this sort of change, we would definitely consider making it fit for welding. So although we don't have permission at the moment to do welding, we would definitely pursue it in this case. And we think it's perfectly viable to do it. We've got an amazing track record now. We've got a lot of experience that can make it work. So we think that's possible. So for that 60 square meter kind of space, we think that's actually something that could be viable. So it is definitely a midterm possibility. It's not something we can press go on tomorrow, but it's something we seriously want to look at. But it's the current site, so it's got the constraints of the current site. So we don't have a roller door, we don't have parking, we don't have lots of space for big projects, things like that. So that's what the large one is. The large is like, if we were going to do like our full-on dream metalworking, it probably wouldn't be on the current site, because we'd probably want things like roller door access, or a lot more floor space to be able to do projects and things like this. So this is kind of like, what's a dream setup look like if we set it up? And I think our conclusion at the moment is we would do this only if we moved Makespace wholesale to a new site. So we've kind of, for the moment, written off the idea of setting up a new satellite site. There's various reasons why that are in the document that I wrote up, but fundamentally, we don't like the idea of splitting up Makespace. It's risky, take on another building that wouldn't necessarily be a final building if there was a bigger one, things like that. But the option there is, well, go nuts, right? We would basically make sure that a bigger site for Makespace would include whatever is necessary for our dream metalwork setup. So the reason that's interesting to understand is, if and when we do look for another site, which in 10 years' time, I'm almost certain we'll be on a different site, but I have no idea in 5 years. We want to know what this should look like, because it becomes part of the spec. So one of my long-term dreams, I guess, is to build a building or allocate a new building that can be for Makespace Forever Home. And I'd really like to understand what it's going to look like, or what it needs to look like from a metalwork perspective. So that's kind of what it's meant to be. And the sort of requirements for that are things like, roller door, so you can turn up with your van or your estate car and take your project out the back and bring it in and work on it and take it away. Anyway, so that's hopefully gives people the framework. There were lots of options, and effectively this is trying to distill it down to 3 very tangible options that we think we want to plan for. And obviously the small and the medium ones are the ones that are most interesting to us nearer term, and the small one, in some sense, it's in our control to execute on that now. So and from a Makespace board point of view, we're kind of, we've sort of provisionally approved that, yeah, we're happy to do something like this now. So that's where we are on those things. Has anyone got any questions on that? Hopefully it gives you a bit of a framing of at least the constraints we think are sensible to work with. Okay, cool. So Mark, if you're online, do you want to just talk about perhaps the group and the capabilities and the corresponding equipment you went through to kind of think about and break down this problem? I can advance the slides if you want.
Yeah, okay. So I guess as part of the looking at these spaces, we tried to think about what sort of projects people had said they wanted to do, both as part of the survey and as within the team, and what we expected the wider membership maybe to want to do. And we started thinking about the what sort of tools they might be needed for those. And some of them clearly fall into categories like this is a kind of extreme example, but a welder is not a lot of use without an angle grinder. Like the two kind of go together. And there's a whole bunch of other capabilities where when you've got one thing, you really need its sister tool or equipment or space to make the most of it. And then we tried to think about the different scales that might be viable and how more space, more tools might enable more capability within that kind of technology or medium. So I've got a few slides kind of thrown together kind of to illustrate this, but the first one is sheet metal working. And it's a bit boring, and people would rarely say, oh, I want to work on sheet metal, but they would often say, I want a bracket to attach like a motor to my bike. I'm motorizing my bike, or I want to attach something to my trailer, or I'm making I want some clips to attach things to a fence post, things like that. And actually what they mean is I want to start with a piece of sheet metal, cut a shape out, and then bend it into a certain form, or put some holes in it in a particular place. And currently what that means at Makespace is probably tin snips, a vise, and a hammer. Maybe you use a jigsaw, maybe you'd use the mill, but maybe you'd use the press. But it's quite manual. You're limited in the scale and the size and the thickness. But that's the sort of thing we could do within the current space. And we could probably expand that a bit with some more kind of small dedicated tools. So there's little jigs and fixtures that can be used to help form sheet metal that could go under the current press or in a vise. But moving up a little bit, going to staying on the sheet metal, on the more sheet metal dedicated tools, like this one in the middle is a combination shear, folder, and bent and roller, and that makes you can make much higher quality things much easier, much more repeatable. And we could possibly fit something like that in the current space. It'd be pretty tight because it's a bit heavy to move around. But if we had quite a lot more space, we'd probably want to go for dedicated kind of single purpose tools, floor standing. So something dedicated just to bending metal, something dedicated just to cutting straight lines, something dedicated to cutting round holes, something dedicated to forming rings. But that just requires lots of space. So in the short term, we're probably talking about things that can be stored under the bench or hung on the wall, or if we could allocate a little bit more space to metalworking, kind of universal combination machines seems like a favored option. And that's allowing that's making brackets and possibly enclosures like electronics enclosures and things like that. So the next category of capability, and this is probably the most popular one, is kind of welding and the tools that go around welding. And the classic example is people who want to make go-karts. But it could equally be a bench or a set of shelving or a trailer at the larger end, or a bike trailer at a slightly smaller end, or even kind of fixing their bike for certain types of welding. And the welding is super flexible and actually doesn't need a whole lot of space. It's mainly the flammability and the gas and the hazards around it that's the limiting factor. But once you've got welding, what else would you want? Well, some way of nicely cutting tube and stock would be good. So kind of the simple ones are an angle grinder, maybe a handheld bandsaw. Moving up, you might want a donkey saw or a larger horizontal bandsaw. and tube working tools tend to go with welding as well. So if you wanted to make a frame like this, you'd need a pipe bender. And you'd probably want to make some sheet metal brackets on here. There's probably a dozen little bits of sheet metal on here, bits in the steering, and the pedals and things like that, engine mounts, seat mounts. There's probably simple sheet metal. So it does go well with the sheet metal as a combination. Yeah, so that's welding. CNC machining is another category. So we have manual metal machining at the moment, both the lathe and the mill. We have a CNC kind of woodworking machine, the router, CNC router, but to kind of accurately make complex shapes, really we need a CNC mill. And again, they come in a range of scales. So there's now quite a few available that are quite capable and can fit on a bench. Okay, there's a few that's Roland scale that can produce quite nice parts. So they could probably produce something like this, but that would sit on an A5 sheet of paper. Say they could produce this kind of shape, this kind of geometry. This is a example of a combat robot, something close to Robert's heart, and this is probably 0.5 meter square, something like that, which would obviously require quite a big machine, floor standing, but probably within the capability of something we could fit within the existing space, with a bit of care and fixturing. It would be the absolute limit of the machine, and we'd probably want a slightly larger machine if we had a bit more space available. CNC machining does kind of sit on its own, as it doesn't need a whole lot of sister technologies, cutting raw material, accurate measuring and marking, that kind of thing, tool storage, material storage. But it's one of the highest skilled metalworking capabilities. Kind of welding and sheet metalworking, you can quite easily train someone up in a typical Makespace training session, and they'll be okay and they can make their project. Like they won't be the best welder, but they could stick metal together. Whereas CNC machining is a very steep learning curve, lots of different skills to master. And so training was a big concern of ours around machining, making sure we either had enough members with the skills available to support it, or partnerships with externals to support the training. And that was something we spent, as a group, we spent a lot of time talking about. And just to kind of back up what Simon was saying, I think that's one of the things around the satellite site, the training and kind of management of the space, looking after the space, becomes very difficult with the satellite sites. So certainly CNC machining is the sort of thing where I'd appreciate someone keeping an eye on me while I was learning or while I was doing it, a more experienced person to kind of casually call on, and the sort of thing you get with a one main space. And then finally, the other aspect we looked at was sheet material cutting in a CNC sense. So the main options there seem to be plasma cutting, water jet, and laser. And the laser, there's kind of two categories of the laser. There's a souped up version of the current laser that can cut thin sheet metal, and then there's serious gas assist kind of kilowatt scale laser cutters that can cut more reasonable, kind of many millimeter thick material. And look, I looked into all of those in quite a lot of detail because it's quite hard to choose between them at first sight. They're all kind of affordable and they're all fit within the space, kind of the footprint we might be able to find. Water jet, horrendously high running costs for anything that's a sensible scale machine. Plasma is a very rough cut quality. They're cheaper, but not significantly cheaper compared to the kind of kilowatt scale laser cutters that can produce phenomenal cuts. So, very intricate, kind of delicate kind of architectural or artistic pieces, or thicker things that can be just welded together, kind of chunky materials. So I think it'd be a fantastic addition to the space on its own, but would go very well with welding and sheet metal working tools. So they were the general categories, and we kind of tried to pick a scale for each of the different space sizes that could allow us to achieve some of each of these categories, because they all kind of came up so frequently in people's projects. We've got on the Google Drive, we've got a spreadsheet that lists out quite specific examples. They're examples, not rather than we have picked this exact tool, but there's links and there's prices. We estimated floor space, and we've got quite a detailed kind of register there of tools we've considered. I think one of the main things that came out of that was the realization that mostly we want space. It's not so much we need all these tools. If we were given a load of space, most of the space we'd allocate to our project, kind of workbenches and floor space, particularly when you get onto the larger projects, like if you want to do anything car scale, trailers, things like that. Metalworking can take up quite a lot of space.
And I think that was quite an interesting insight into the sort of, it's more the scale of the project that define, and not necessarily exclusively, obviously, but the scale of the project more defines the space you need than the tools themselves, which I thought was really.
Yeah, it was interesting, particularly like a welder. A welder can fit under a bench and take up almost no space, and the more space you have, the bigger the project. And some people did want to build quite large projects. Melanie talked about building a new fence, needing quite.
I think it's probably a good idea if you put that link into the chat where it's clickable.
Yeah, can do that. Is that a fair summary? People who are on the group, in the group, of what we discussed?
Yes, pretty much sums it up.
I have to say, for someone reading the information, the thinking you put together, it was very nice to have this sense of. I mean, I didn't necessarily like your names of profiling and something else. I can't even remember what it was called, but there's effectively cutting sheet metal, there's milling, and then there was welding, and these are almost like the three pillars and then there's loads of glue in between, obviously, but it was quite interesting to see that those were almost like the three pillars of construction, whereas and CNC and CNC milling and CNC laser might have significant cost associated with them, where welding not so much in terms of the equipment, but it obviously does in terms of making sure the space can support it and things like that. But that seemed, for me, a really natural way of thinking about it. I found that very, very helpful. Was there any, so I think the next thing we're going to go on to is actually about what, given the small, medium and large kind of allocations, what we'd allocate. But on that thing of effectively the equipment and the capabilities, was there anyone else who had any additional thoughts or insights that you, especially the group that was working on that you came up with that are worth sharing, so we don't recover perhaps old ground again going forward?
Could I raise one issue about material, bit of metal for using in projects? I recently did a project that required a number of 75 centimeter lengths of metal, and buying 1 meter lengths was an expensive way of doing it. I ended up ordering from a company a 3 meter length and got them to cut it into 75 centimeter lengths for me, which saved me a lot of money. And maybe getting together on what bits of metal we want could be an asset. Yeah,
absolutely. I think certainly for the laser cutter or sheet metalworking materials, it's quite practical to have a nice stock of 0.5 millimeter, 1 millimeter, 3 millimeter material, maybe in aluminium, stainless and mild steel, something like that. And you can cover quite a wide range of needs with not a whole lot of space, and really makes it a lot easier for prototyping and building things. The kind of bar, stock, and tube, there's so many permutations. We talked about it, and I think having a rack would be very helpful. But it can get quite expensive quite fast to cover a range. So
I imagine if we had a profiling machine like a laser cutter or a plasma table, then like we do with the laser cutters, a small stock of metal that lets you get going on your project that day would be good, something we'd aim for. But yeah, no, because there's an infinite number of bits of metal out there. I think the best we could do is provide a dumping ground for offcuts.
I suppose just kind of going back to the different capabilities, I have very much focused on the common elements and the things we spent the most time talking about. Once we got into what people would like to do and trying to cover all of the projects that people had responded to the survey would like to do, we ended up with quite a long list of kind of smaller, not headline, not super expensive, but quite a long list of tools. So like a kiln for heat treating, maybe a forge, kind of brazing tools, gas torch, attachments for hydraulic presses, things like that. So there's just like with the woodworking, there's a whole range of smaller, kind of more specialist tools that need to be built up, an arsenal that needs to be built up. The same is assumed for the metalworking as well. We've just not kind of focused on it here.
Have you considered storage space for metal? Like we have the cupboards for the lasers, they take up quite a lot of space, and metal would need something similar and be very space hungry.
Yeah, I think we'd probably want to keep, if we're in the existing space, like 1 meter square sheet metal would probably be the kind of standardish size, or 1.2 by 1.2.
I was talking about people bringing their own stock in even.
Yeah, I think we'd need a rack with marked out areas.
I mean, we've already got quite a lot of metal storage squirreled away in different areas in Makespace. Trove used to
Don't
have
tell
a
anyone.
shelf.
They'll find it.
Yeah, squirreled is the right word, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all over the place in little cupboards.
I mean, it's a really serious consideration, because if it is the difference between you being able to turn up and cut something and walk away with it versus you have to somehow work out how you're going to order a sheet and get it in and cycle it in, even for a lot of people, that for the sheet, I can see that being really valuable. So I think Alaric's right. Whether it's your own stock or other stock, that's probably where a serious amount of the space goes, isn't it? And especially because it's heavy, presumably, right? I mean,
yeah. And
like
awkward
when
to handle.
storage is overstocked, it becomes actually quite dangerous, as you try and shove things in and then they slip and then you catch yourself on it and stuff like that. So
to be fair, we didn't come to a conclusion other than we need to allocate space to it. It requires space, and
Glyn, I mean, based on your question, which is the one that sort of triggered this, how much flexibility would you have had in the type of stock that you could have used? Because I think Mark said the sheet metalworking sheet is fairly simple. I almost consider that like the ply and acrylic stock, but what you were talking about was not that. So, I mean, was it pretty much something you had to do, and it was about more like a club purchase and somewhere to stock it or something like that? Or
well, I was basically building a bike trailer by taking 2 bike wheels and a load of lengths of aluminium to knit it all together to make a bike trailer, and that's the beginning and end of it. It will.
That would suggest maybe that there's a level of flexibility in the material you would have chosen had something been available.
Yes.
Whereas I guess, Mark, are you talking about more like milling stock? So, for example, if you're going to stock, is that?
Yeah. Like if you're milling something, if you need it to be 2 inches high, you need 2 inches. You can't cope with 1 inch thick material. Whereas I guess if you're making a tubular frame and you're welding it, then you probably have quite a lot of flexibility over different wall thicknesses and diameters, say.
Yeah, so that for a lot of framework, whether it's these sort of little structures, and brackets and things like that. I presume that it's not quite Meccano, but it's almost like what I remember, the 1 centimeter, square wood, and the triangle card triangles that schools used to do, right? That's the de facto material to build a lot of things out of.
Yeah,
I'm guessing, with 1 or 2 different types of tubing, you could solve a lot of those people's substructure. It wouldn't be ideal, but they're given having to source materials themselves. Maybe it's interesting, but
well, sourcing materials is actually not difficult. What I find is that the natural length of steel, if you buy it at the cheapest price, is 7 meters, which cuts neatly to 3.5 meters, and that fits on my rack.
yeah, okay. Any other questions? So Glyn, I think that was a really good one. So we're highlighting storage. Was there any other things that people wanted to raise that were again, perhaps topics that were discussion that, again, it'd be nice if everyone was on the same page so we didn't have to reopen discussions, or just to bring insight, other insights.
One other branch of metalwork, which would probably be a minority thing, is casting, whether we want any facilities for that in medium or large. So crucible and whatever the thing you put the molds in and so on. But that's an alternative way of making complex 3D shapes that you'd otherwise have to mill.
You also have to make the molds first, which is an art in itself. And I can see people just cursing a blue streak when they made a mold that they finally figure out won't release. Apart from that, of course, what we can cast is somewhat limited. Just don't see us melting iron.
It's a good point there, but I would love to try the lost PLA process, which I think sort of combines our lasers with new technology.
I mean, we assumed as we were doing the stuff, like as we were kind of making up the lists, that if we got more space and we had access to welding, then we could start looking into things like a forge and buying crucibles and some of the supporting gear. And then, yeah, it's plaster of Paris, lost PLA, or wooden molds, or sand. Again, it's not heavy stuff, but it does require space to store and space to use, which we will not have at a zero space and may not have as an expansion of the existing site.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's fine to put, like, it's useful to note some of these things down as ideas, because then they can not be forgotten. But I think in general, this idea of focusing on a few key processes, and then I think someone was talking about this very similar to how the woodshop evolved. Actually, we probably got a few things, and then lots of the gaps got filled over time as people needed the smaller tools and these additional things. Like, there's lots of these things that get added when someone finds a need. I'm guessing casting, it doesn't quite fall into that, because that is pretty much, bootstrapping a whole new process. But I wouldn't be surprised if people do some sort of casting themselves, like try and do it with, I guess, you do it, with sand, and I have no idea.
I know
that big. We have to remember there's two ways. Oh, I like to think about it this way. There's projects that are equipment, and then there's equipment, right? And it's perfectly fine that someone builds a CNC router, but that's not the solution that we give to everyone. So if someone might, as a project, experiment with casting and stuff, if it's safe, and I don't understand enough to know if it's safe, but that doesn't mean we have to provide the equipment and the facilities to do it, because that itself might be the project to start with, and that might actually introduce us to those sort of ideas. So
that's what Dublin Hackerspace did. They made their own casting stuff.
Right, and that's presumably that also identified some people who cared about it, which is brilliant, right? So, a lot of this is actually making sure that there's a critical mass of people to make the things successful. Otherwise, they just sit in the corner and don't get used, which is actually negative for two reasons, right? It's negative because it's an opportunity cost of the space it takes up, and it's negative because people see the opportunity to use it, but let's say the training isn't in place and they can't use it, so it's actually it was never given. Even though they couldn't do it, it was given to them and then taken away, right? So it's net negative twice.
The story of my life, as far as the mill is concerned, the big one. Just
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Okay.
was thinking that casting has been superseded in a lot of different places by either metal filament printing or ceramic resin printing. So there's a question for whether that's necessary or useful or not in this day and age.
Yeah, and presumably this is also things where maybe the process of prototyping the part could be done in Makespace, but actually, in some medium, but then the casting might be going to someone outside to say, no, you've got confidence in the part and the shape of the part, but it's built in foam or something, I have no idea. And then you go somewhere else who actually has the facilities to do it for you, but Makespace has taken out a huge amount of the risk and the learning and experimentation and things like that. So, that's also a net win. Mark, should we go on to the next? Or is it? Yeah. Has anyone got any
Yes.
other things that came up?
I just have one more question actually around the equipment. So one thing we didn't discuss was additive metalworking. So like metal 3D printing. I don't know enough about it at all to whether it is even feasible or it's so expensive to run. It's not an option. But is that something that was looked at all? And was there a reason why you haven't included that because it is so expensive or complex to run?
That's a brilliant question, Charles.
It is, and we did look into it, and certainly the cost of the machines is falling. It would still be kind of half of the total budget, even in the largest case. I think it's still a significant amount of money.
Yeah.
The off-putting thing was the cost of the raw material and the handling of that raw material. We get the impression they're not so much highly skilled to use, but very sensitive to the environment and have to be very carefully managed, on a very professional basis. So no contamination of the chamber. Maybe you need to purge the build chamber before it starts printing. So kind of pushing you towards a single run of many parts rather than, one person comes in and does their job and then another person comes straight in afterwards and does another job. And it seems to be, it's getting close to being kind of Makespace scale cost, feasible, but not yet. That's the powder one was one we looked at. The other one, it's sort of extrusion, but then it's kind of post-processed. It's kind of sintered and cured. And that's kind of similar. It needs quite a bit of auxiliary equipment, and it's still quite expensive.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mark. Yeah. So it's like a step above what we have, obviously, with the ABS and the PLA printers, which can be problematic.
Charles,
in their own right, yes.
The reason why I think this is a good question is because I think it's really important for people to sort of understand the weird financial dynamics or the weird way we should be thinking about Makespace, right? Because the capital to purchase a machine is not what we should be focusing on. So that's the sort of thing we can go to people and say, hey, we'd really like to enable this capability. Would you sponsor us to buy this machine, whatever, right? So for big capital expenditure, we can go to the Cambridge community and help fund capital, right? But which is a bit weird, right? And in some sense,
to be clear, for those who have not kind of been involved in Makespace and understand this has happened kind of multiple times, and it's definitely happened, and it's Simon's very good at it amongst other people involved in Makespace.
The thing to think about is, we've also got a lot of members, right? So something can get used by a lot of members, right? But the real thing that actually is the reason why something makes sense or not is more once it exists, is it accessible? Can it actually be used by a bunch of people, or is it really such a specialist piece of equipment that only one person can use it and therefore it just doesn't make sense? Is the operating cost of it, whether that's the maintenance running cost or the materials running cost or whatever, prohibitively high such that actually most members couldn't make good use of it because of financial reasons, right? So actually, if the machine was really super expensive and we had to go and talk to the machine manufacturer and get the machine, that might not be a barrier. Like it could be a very high priced piece of machine. But if the operational costs are high, which are covered by members' fees, right? So we never want to get ourselves into a situation where we have to beg for sponsorship or charity to be able to operate. right? And that's kind of like the magic. It's like once we, if we can operate based on our membership fees, then we are, we're not having to go and beg or be at risk, right? It makes us very low risk, and that's one of the core principles is that Makespace should run forever at low risk. It might get bigger through capital injections and things like that, but actually operationally it's very, very low risk, because that's important to make sure it's there for members all the time. So yeah, if these I'd be really interested for people to study these processes, because they will change. Like fiber lasers, when I was talking to Chris from HPC 5 years ago or something, about plasmas, he was saying, yeah, no, wait, there's these fiber things coming along, and they're dropping in price, right? And they're now in our price bracket, right? So it may be the same for the metal if the operational cost of running it for an individual, well, for Makespace and for an individual hits it, which I think in reality, Mark, you're saying it doesn't. And that's the bit we should be studying with any technologies, yeah.
Well, I've been looking into different metal-based manufacturing methods on the 3D printing sector for quite a while. And I've got to agree, unfortunately, because of the fact that these materials that they are using usually ID tagged, manufacturer locked, and they are part of the revenue stream coming from the machines. So the machines drop in price, and the raw materials get higher, and so they put a chip in there, so you can't use any other material. That is actually what's making it prohibitively expensive. Industry likes that concept because it means that they have less capital investment, which they have to go to their shareholders for, and have a little bit higher operating costs that can be offset by profits. But we work exactly the other way around.
Well, potentially. I mean, someone offered us a very fancy 3D printer recently, and that would have been free basically, but the operational cost was very high, and it just didn't make sense. So,
that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
For us, the equation is different than it is for the industry. But the industry wants low upfront cost and high running cost, because that can be offset by profits from the product if it's successful. Otherwise, you just fold. Or but we are on the other side of the equation. We need low running costs.
Mark, should we go? Go on to the next section? Just because then we're basically done.
Yep.
So this is basically, again, kind of give a bit of context for what I think the team felt could fit in these sort of environments. It's slightly skewed by the constraints I put back on it, but yeah, do you want to talk through it, Mark?
Yeah, so I guess I've pulled out the key things from the different categories we talked about earlier. One key realization was this small CNC mill that's the Bantam CNC mill that's just been launched, appears to have very good machining capabilities for its size, quite user friendly, so to make the training easier, and certainly much more accessible for general Makespace members compared to the kind of more pro CNC mills. And we think we could do that within literally zero space if we replaced the Roland, but given we're not that tight on space that we have to sell the Roland or park the Roland in order to make room for this, we could probably run both in parallel for a period and kind of use it to check for demand.
Yeah, I mean, the 0 square meters was a philosophy that you presented, or the team presented, which I thought was a really nice way of thinking about it, and actually, like, how far can we actually get given? Now, I think the reality is we can, we've got space and we can shuffle things around if it's the right environment and So, yeah, I think squinting a little bit is fine.
Yeah.
To be worked out, but it's not the same as going like we actually need a whole new room.
Yeah, and part of that kind of going on, not necessarily zero, but based on the relatively easy flexibility within the current space, we spent a lot of time thinking about handheld tools that would allow more metalworking. So things that could be hung on walls, put in drawers, under benches. Space that we've got and is quite flexible, but can be pulled out when someone wants to do metalworking. So for that, it's kind of handheld metal cutting tools like a nibbler or a handheld bandsaw, angle grinder, die grinder, things to make adjustments and remove metal.
I
Whether
note
that's
that grindstone is absent from your list.
bench grinder.
Yep.
It's on the list. It's just not on. It didn't make the top 5.
Okay.
There is.
At one point, I saw one at Makespace actually, since vanished somewhere, but we did have one.
Yeah, I was going to say there is a bit of overlap on tools that are sort of there. Maybe the safety procedures are not there and the training's not there, so they've been and gone. But I think as part of this exercise, we may be able to revitalize a full kind of suite. And the biggest one we were kind of pushing for as a group, and it definitely would require a bit of space reallocation, was a bench top kind of combination sheet metal tool. The picture I showed before of the combined roll, shear, and break for bending and cutting sheet metal is just a bit on the big side to be shoved under a bench. You'd need 2 or 3 people to lift it up. But if we could make room for that, it would really open up the sheet metal capabilities and allow people to make little metal enclosures and brackets.
Or it could be on a wheeled table so we can move it out from somewhere not so accessible, because sometimes we want long things sticking out of it.
Yep, yeah. I guess kind of like the vacuum former's on a bit of a trolley, isn't it? That kind of thing.
Anyway, I was thinking, and I have not got the spreadsheet open. Was there any consideration of a larger bench-mounted sheet metal shear or cutter?
I think we moved the dedicated shear to the medium space, and we said if we're trying to keep this very compact, then a combination machine is probably the kind of the trade-off.
I presume, Mark, that falls into what you were talking about. Actually, a lot of this is about making sure you've got sensible space around it so the machines can be used safely while other people are in the space. And that is that sort of problem you hit, is it?
Yeah. With some of the tools, it was kind of, well, you could do it, but you'd have to take over the whole of the bench in the woodworking shop, and it'd be a bit of a struggle. So,
other people isn't really a consideration at the moment with COVID and all.
So
Mark,
on that one, the benchtop CNC mill. I don't know how many people are familiar with what was proposed by the group there, but the Bantam is effectively something very similar size to the Roland, as far as I could tell, certainly in terms of bench space. And I perhaps you could describe the sort of size of part and types of materials it could do, because I'd actually really like to get a sense of how many people would feel like they would use it, because one of your earlier comments was CNC is actually towards the higher end of complexity. So obviously we're constrained by space, but to bring in the CNC is sort of counterintuitive in the sense that it's the higher end of complexity. But I from a space perspective, it totally makes sense. So can you just describe
I would consider the CNC rather essential, actually. Even though I have the capability here at home, I'm limited to a very, very small workspace of only 240 by 90 millimeters. And I would definitely do larger jobs at Makespace. And I believe that just being able to do these cuts from solid material makes the whole thing worthwhile. If we can't weld, I mean, if we could weld, things take on another scale. But like this, CNC is essential. And I've been to Makespace.
But Melanie, just to pause you for a minute, is it all right if Mark gives people an overview of what the Bantam is, so people actually know what's being talked about? Because I think you're aware of what it is. But
I was almost done anyway.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I went to Makespace a number of times, also during the lockdown. I have never, ever seen anybody use the Roland.
Well, so some of the emails we did get over lockdown were from businesses who wanted to know when they could get access again because they've been using the Roland. So I know it does get used, but I think you're right; it doesn't get used that much.
Simon, can you just try going back a slide and then forward a slide? I've put a picture in the edited.
Oh, do you want me? I can.
if you can refresh it somehow. I don't know if
let
that.
me let me refresh it. Oh, there you go.
Oh, there we go.
Brilliant.
There we go. Yeah.
So I think this is really useful because I mean I'm sure some of you know what this is, but this is whether it's exactly this machine or not. But I think in the proposal this was the exact machine you were talking about. Just to give a, can you just perhaps talk it through so people get an idea?
Yeah. So from a materials point of view, the Roland is soft materials, like really soft, the plastics and woods and foams. This is rigid enough that it can basically cut anything that can be cut. So if you can mill something, whether it's steel or titanium or brass or aluminium, it'll cut it. It won't be super fast, and certainly it's optimized for materials that require quite high tool speed. So aluminium and plastics and maybe brass, where the cutting speed is fast, it would work best for that. And the material removal rates are actually pretty good. I wouldn't be surprised if this could remove material as fast as the Warco mill, like a manual person using the Warco mill, because some of the videos I've seen, the chips really fly from this machine.
And from what I saw, that I mean, they've basically said aluminium only, haven't they now?
Yeah, their most recent postings, they've removed even mild steel from the material handling.
Yeah, I think
which is a little bit similar to the Roland. So when we purchased the Roland, it was quite clear that it could do soft metals. I forget what the exact it could say, and partly through Makespace's decision and partly through their further recommendations, they did back up and it became more plastics and stuff. And I think this feels very similar. They've gone out and gone, well, it can do everything, and then they've backed off, presumably as they've realized that.
So just to kind of round out the kind of capabilities, it's got a roughly kind of 150 by 200 millimeter by about 75 millimeter, 100 millimeter high working volume. So it is quite small, but I think for a lot of projects, metalworking projects, is still big enough. So if you wanted to attach a motor to your bike and you needed a bracket making, custom motor mount or something like that, you could still make it. Robert could make a lot of his robot parts on this. So I think it's been a long time since I've seen a part bigger than that on the Warco mill, actually. Most projects would fit in that.
I've never had the opportunity to put parts on the Warco mill, otherwise you would have seen some bigger ones, all right?
So the big thing with the Bantam that's different from other CNC mills I've seen is the control system really walks you through. So it's, I think, some ways similar to the Roland, but it says how to load your stock, how to zero the stock, and it has automated routines for that. So it's not you have to go in there with measuring tools or shims of paper or to align the material. It has a probing routine, and you tell it roughly what's going on, and it automatically probes.
Does it mean that it actually would limit somebody who's experienced in what they can do?
No. There's options within it to allow you to do both. And I suspect what's going on with these this material limitation is they're saying we've got recipes for the standard tooling kit and standard materials that you just say, I'm using a 6mm cutter on aluminium, and it does the right feeds and speeds. It's a recipe, and steel will need a very particular recipe that might be very situation dependent, and it's not in their recipe book. So I would say, well, I've cut aluminium on the CNC router at Makespace, but we leave that as a very expert option because it's so finicky, but it's possible. I think steel is probably in this category with this machine. I'm sure it'll do it. I'm sure it'll do it.
That makes sense, yeah.
But presumably the default would be blocks of aluminium is what you make, because if,
yes,
it's probably fine, right? And it's only in the case where it's not fine and there's a legitimate reason why you wouldn't use aluminium, that's when, and you'd have the skill to understand that as well. That's when it might start doing other things. Okay.
And like we've got recipes for the laser cutter and the CNC router, if you're cutting this material, you need to go at this speed and this power. We may end up with our own recipes and say, you can cut steel, you just need to do it very slowly with this particular cutter of your own, you know, or something like that.
One thing I can bring to the table here and offer is I have a subscription for professional application that gets updated with materials and bits and feeds and speeds and tool materials and everything. And if you give me like 40 or so items as a list, I can run through software and put the feeds and speeds down.
Yeah, and I use GWizard for that, and that's why I can say I think this machine can cut other materials. You just need to be very careful about the tooling and the feeds and speeds.
I mean, does anyone have any questions about this type of machine and the capabilities? And I mean, I guess Zoom can do a voting, but I mean, is there a sense that people would actually use this, or is this? I know, Robert, I think you said yeah, and
I believe people use it, especially if those people who are less experienced are guided by the software. It's a definite plus.
Yes, I'd use it, not very often, but I'd certainly have some projects to do on it.
And I guess maybe Adrian's got some questions here as well. But if this is not necessarily the question, but it's a thought experiment to help my thinking. Given the option of having the Roland and this, or having two of these, what would people?
Two of these definitely, because they can do pretty much everything the Roland can.
I think the experience we had with the Ultimakers is kind of relevant, isn't it? Because we had a mixture of machines, of 3D printers, and then after a while we said, let's just standardize, because we know they're good, we know how they work, everyone's trained on them. Let's go with that. And I think maybe we don't immediately standardize because we need to see how people use them and if they have strengths and weaknesses within what people Makespace want to do.
Like I say, it may not have been a sensible question, because it may not. The reason we have multiple printers is partly a throughput. Throughput was more valuable than the fact that someone turned up and they could start a print job was more valuable than a diversity of printers that are unlikely to be able to start a job. So I don't know with this whether actually throughput is going to be an issue, and whether two would do. It was more just a challenge. Let me understand the Roland thing. Sorry,
so one major difference between this and the Roland is that this has a smaller bed size than the Roland. It takes up the same amount of space, but due to the rigidity of it and the space needed for that rigidity, it can't cut as bigger objects. Although that being said, I don't think anyone's ever used the full size of the Roland, and if they have, there's always the CNC router.
Yeah.
So
I mean, because it's also training reasons as well, right? It's okay, Adrian.
We have to recognise that the Roland is really intended to be a small scale training machine, and Mark's right. It's targeted particularly at modelling phones, and it works nicely up to wood. Although I have one at work that we use for metal. It's not really intended for metal. You can make it do it, but it's hard work. I think what's really neat about this thing is it actually fills the gap that folks who learn to do something on the Roland want to do next, which is to do something in aluminium or brass or whatever. And I actually see the two together as quite a complementary set, where the Roland is a very painless learning introduction. And then moving to whether you move from there to the router or you move to this potentially makes a very easy access route.
I mean, so the reason why, I was probably the guy who kind of put forward the Bantam in the first place. The reason I put it forward as part of the Zero Space application was to get rid of the Roland. Either turf it into a skip due to the many times it's gone horrible on me, or just the sheer annoyance of not being able to do metal on it. One of the joys of the Bantam is, as Mark mentioned earlier, it's designed for schools. It's designed, well, much like the Roland, it's designed for schools. It's designed for CNC courses, technician courses. It can hold your hand completely at the beginning, and then towards the end, you can get rid of a lot of the hand holding and do it yourself. once you're confident with it. And we felt that this training pathway meant you could go from knowing nothing about CNC to being pretty good and ready for like a 5-second training course on the CNC router, or a much shorter training course on the eventual walk-in CNC mill that we'll totally get for the new space.
Yeah.
Right.
So I
Right.
think that the proposal you had for later was for like a Tormac 770, or Adrian, you were looking at like
110.
1100
Yeah.
or something. And I assume in those cases where we would have that, we would still want a training mill, right?
Yes.
Because to let someone loose on the what do you call it, Robert? The walk-in one. I mean, we don't want. I don't know what sort of adjustments people are doing in a walk-in one, but it would seem like having a training path would be a good idea anyway, right?
Yeah, it's really about addressing that incredibly steep learning curve.
Yeah, which is kind of Mark's earlier point, right? That
Yeah.
CNC has a very high barrier to entry.
Yes, I've got to say, I found subtractive scary when I first started to skirt around the edges. It was pretty scary. I've crashed things a few times. I've broken bits. This is what happens. And yes, the Roland definitely, well, you have to work hard at crashing it. You have to work hard at breaking a bit.
So I mean, we don't need to go into the details about whether this replaces the Roland or is in addition to the Roland. I think we'll learn very quickly by observation, and we'll be able to make the trade-off of whether training people on two different platforms is valuable versus, you know, because I don't know where the workflows would split and things like that. So I think that's something that we should look at. So I think the question is whether something like this would make sense in the case that we had the sort of Tormac type CNC as well.
Oh yeah,
right?
definitely.
And I think I'm getting the sense that actually it would make sense as well. So it's not a blocker to a decision of, oh well, should we wait in case we've got more space where we could get a Tormac, because it doesn't feel like that sort of blocker. It feels like we would have this or a Roland or the equivalent desktop thing anyway. That's what everyone seems to be, well, certainly what Adrian, Robert, and Mark and Melanie seem to have said so far. I don't know if anyone's else got any.
And certainly at the price point that it is, if it was twice the price it is, we'd be thinking harder about it. I think at its price point, it's not a very hard.
Yeah. I mean, this is the sort of price point for that. If we could buy it, and if it was successful, consider buying another one. If throughput became an issue, right? It's that sort of thing, and we don't have to. If it's not getting used, we don't have to. So that's great. Okay, that's really valuable. Okay, well, I think that in some sense makes it quite easy. This decision about replacing the Roland versus augmenting the Roland isn't so clear to me. Adrian, I think you'd value having it both. I think I can see the logic in that too. Like this thing, if it got sorry.
It may be that the route we go sort of reveals itself. But I think the low impact route is to assume they're in parallel at the moment, with neither one being preferred over the other, and we use that as a
right. Well, we may, and Robert, I am sure you will hate to hear this. We may find that the YouTube videos are very sexy, and then we get delivered something that breaks down every day, right? I don't think it will. These guys have got experience, but you know what I mean, right? We don't know.
Oh, very much so.
One thing I'm missing here in the picture is that there is no kind of coolant. And now I found that for my mill, I need both mist and flood, because aluminum is notoriously sticky. And actually the mill that I'm seeing fitted on there, the bit, is not one I would choose for aluminum. So I'm just wondering, should I believe the hype?
They don't have coolant in there, that's true. But it's been used by enough independent machinists that I think there's substance behind the hype.
Okay, but so how's the chip clearance happening then? You have to stop it all the time and brush it off?
It's a question of tooling and grade of aluminium.
So maybe this is the sort of details that the group can go and have a look at, right? I mean, I think this sounds quite, this is quite in depth, and it's worth the research. But I think at the top level, there's obviously motivation to introduce this sort of facilities. The reason I was interested, like if this was used by someone to cut foam, would that upset the next job coming along that happens to be aluminium, or vice versa? Like someone's just cut aluminium and then you come to use foam. Those are the sort of things I don't know. We'd learn, etc.
I've just found their list of recommended materials, and unfortunately, chocolate and cheese are on the don't mill these materials list, which I'm quite disappointed about.
Well, maybe there is life in the Roland yet. Okay, so does it? I mean, this makes sense for everyone in terms of the sort of what I mean, and this is the thing that I think we're kind of okay to. If the proper plans were in place, we're kind of okay to go ahead with. Obviously, we have to check it and check it all makes sense, and just check the due diligence of like what you're talking about, what it could do makes sense. But this feels very viable and a really nice step along the path of exploring this area quickly, in the sense that it's not blocked by facilities, and it's sort of in our control. Do you want to go on to the next one though? Mark, just so it'd be nice to get through basically the presentation by 9, just so people can drop off if they need to.
Yeah.
Oh, there's no picture now. There's the absence of picture.
Yeah. I didn't fill these out. So I think the main thing that very definitely top of the list was the MIG welder. Whether that is viable within the current space, I don't know. It's not a space question, it's a building and permissions question and safety question.
Well, I think it is also a bit of a space question, just by having space around. Like I say, there's room, but that's something maybe that you can help or the group can help us understand better.
Yeah.
But as a general rule of thumb, I think that this was a good split. But we can, it's all assumptions, right?
Yeah. We think we could fit a metal cutting laser in a medium space, something with kind of similar bed size to the current lasers, maybe. The machine would be a little larger, need gas cylinders for the gas assist to be stored somewhere. But that seems quite viable. A full-scale CNC mill, so there isn't actually a whole lot of footprint difference between the Tormac 770 and the 1100. So we could pick between them, I think. But we could fit a floor standing one in that space. Okay. Expanding the sheet metal tools, and I've put hydraulic press down, but really there's quite a long list of tools quite similar to a press that kind of expand the arsenal, widen the capabilities, and then material storage we've talked about, but some sort of bar stock rack and sheet metal rack.
So I think you probably covered.
I think we were thinking of just a MIG welder for the to start with. It's mainly because it's the easiest to use, easiest to get going on, and sufficient for most projects. Once we get to a larger space, I think it would make sense to go with MIG and TIG because of the extra flexibility that TIG allows.
This was just for people's heads. This was the sort of imagine.
But I guess we'd have to see the TIG unit on its own doesn't take a whole lot of space. It's just another separate training program that would be required. So it's mainly the training cost that would put off the TIG in a smaller space.
Okay. Should we go to the large one as well? Because I think.
Is there anything else to say on this?
No,
I mean, between this and the larger space, we ended up finding there wasn't a whole lot of difference in terms of the types of capabilities. Maybe a slightly larger machine in some cases, but in general, we ended up using the the larger space enabled was a wider variety of tools and much more room for big projects. So a medium space, it'd be very hard to do very large projects because kind of maybe a third of it is taken up with tooling and benches. Whereas with a large space, we could afford to dedicate space for large projects, decent sized space for material storage, and start to get into the dedicated sheet metal working tools. So the a box and pan folder, a full size guillotine, maybe a punch, maybe a full slip roller. They take up a lot of space. They're not very expensive. They're quite easy to train on, but they do need a good few square meters of floor space each. But they make working on sheet metal projects so much nicer and faster. It'd be worth having them, the variety there. And I've put horizontal bandsaw because Simon was offended when the first thing we mentioned before was the donkey saw. But certainly, with in the medium and the large
Donkey saws
space, we
have
want
bad
a
memories
nice
for
way of cutting bar stock, and a tube stock.
You do know you're not meant to put donkeys through a donkey saw, Simon.
The medium space, the tube bender might be a handheld or a vice-mounted tube bender. In the large space, we might start thinking about maybe a hydraulic bender. It's been a while since I've bent any tube on the scale of a go-kart, so I'm not quite sure whether a hydraulic bender is required for a typical kind of go-kart build.
There's one in Makespace right now.
Benders are sufficient.
That kind of tubing I've always been able to bend with a with one that I can just put a foot on and bend on the floor.
I have a feeling.
Anything else,
Mark? Can you hear us?
worth talking about?
I have a feeling Mark can't hear us. Can people hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
I can hear you.
Yes.
But I don't know if Mark can hear us for some reason.
I'll
Yes,
message him.
Certainly we definitely thought that the CNC mill, it'd be nice to have that kind of progression from something that's maybe a bit more user friendly, a bit less intimidating, easier workflow onto the machines. Most of the other metalworking machines we're talking about, the training load is not too bad and they're not too daunting. Yeah.
There's a question on the training and whether we should go to a pre-recorded training video, a safety quiz. And
So Simon, I think it might be worth talking a little bit more about the medium space, because we talked quite a while about the small space and what we could do with small rearrangements in Makespace.
well, thank you for taking over me.
I think Mark can't hear us.
Are we talking about sacrificing the classroom for more metalworking space, or are there more kind of, let's say, win-win options?
So okay, so Mark's asked the question, but I don't know if he can hear the answer. So hopefully he'll realise that my mouth is moving and he's not hearing it. Yeah, so the small space is something that I think we're in a position to look at how we jiggle stuff now. The medium space, I think there's an option to rearrange the space as it stands or expand. My preference at the moment is to look to see if we could expand first, and once if that has been exhausted, then consider rearrangement of the existing space, because we may come up with a compromise in that case. If we can expand, I think we can actually achieve the medium space as laid out. I think certainly that's what I'd be aiming for. That's the kind of plans I'm trying to scheme at the moment. But now's not an ideal time. So this might be 6 months before we even have a hint of whether this is actually possible. But I think that's the right thing to do. It's something that I'd definitely like exploring. That the expansion of space is something I definitely want to keep in the reserve of the board. So it's not something I want members getting involved in. These are sensitive and careful decisions that we have to approach people about. So yeah, my plan over the next 6 months is to look and see if we can have an option for expansion. We could do some of the thought experiments about rearrangement. It wouldn't be my first choice. But yeah, I mean, we could argue, well, COVID means that events in the space aren't going to happen at the scale they were previously. So maybe the classroom isn't going to get the utilization beyond, desk work, which is not a top priority for us. Maybe that should become the wood shop. That's an option. Or maybe the trove or the office, can be refactored or something. Or to be honest, the main space, there is space in there, especially for enclosed machines. So there are options. But my preference is whilst the small space is, the small option is being explored, and almost that's a bit of an on-ramp to really getting the metalwork in Makespace starting to form and a group around it. We in parallel explore whether expansion is an option. That would be my default. Yeah.
I'd like to get back for a moment to the proposal I was going to get into when I was talked over, which is that we could potentially go and split the trainings into the online safety training quizzes that we already do, then have larger groups of people who profess proficiency with the tool in question. So just simply quickly, one after the other, demonstrate said proficiency, bouncing them down to the slower track groups if they don't have it, and then have the slower track groups. It would mean that a lot of people who are already experts or semi-experts with a given tool would not have to go through the whole introduction of the tool for the newcomer, for the beginner, and therefore streamline training in such a degree that we can accommodate the higher learning curves for the ones that do need the hand-holding, and still get people trained up to these tools.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to
Our
understand.
current training regime totally ignores a prior knowledge of the people who are being trained. It totally ignores whether somebody already has the said tool at home. It already ignores if somebody's even worked in a business where they've used this tool day to day. And we are just wasting a lot of training time telling people the basics who already know all the tricks.
So perhaps just a quick input here. We're definitely looking at the training models. I mean, obviously our biggest challenge is always bringing somebody in who's never done any of these things before. But I think, as we spoke about in one of the metalwork sessions, the directors are open to exploring other routes.
Well, yes,
and it's not something that we've been able to do easily in the past, but now that we're trying to rationalize our introductory training, perhaps as a second stage to that, we can look at the parallel inputs to training.
Yes, we've been running in training basically on inertia, doing it the way it's ever been done before, but actually going new routes and exploring new options is something that only COVID has brought about. Just let's not waste that opportunity.
Yeah.
If I could come in here very quickly, training on the metal lathe, one of the biggest problems I have is people come in and, oh no, I've already used a lathe, I'm really experienced, I know this. And actually when you get training, they don't. So there would be the danger of people claiming they're experienced when they're not, and then skipping the whole training.
So I think let's not chew the session up in a training discussion. I think it's quite, I think what we have to assume is we can address health and safety requirements. We find a way to address it, and we can address training requirements. I think critical here is understanding how we move the notion of enhancing metalworking at Makespace forward.
Yeah, so Mark, I think that, I don't know if that answered your question about the medium session, but stage. But I think given the state we're in with COVID and things like that, and the opportunity to expand the initial, some of the initial capabilities, I would assume that the medium option or whatever, we should consider that's at least 6 months off as an option. But that that window of exploring whether whether we could allocate that sort of space gives us a nice on ramp to see a nice metalwork community grow, and these things about training and all these sort of things be fleshed out. If that sounds reasonable to people, I think that's certainly what I'd be comfortable with. I assume, Adrian, you're kind of comfortable with that sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. We've in parallel to understanding how we get there, we do all the other things we need to understand to get to that point as well.
Yeah, Mark, can you hear us again now?
Yes. Sorry.
I think you couldn't. You couldn't hear anyone else.
No,
so
no.
You were happily talking over everyone.
As I put on the chat, my cat walked on the mute button, and I didn't know the volume down button. I didn't notice. I did wonder why you weren't interjecting. I was expecting. It was a very unusual feeling.
Yeah. I'm sure it was a bit unnerving, wasn't it? Yeah. Right. So let's go on to the last bit to make it happen, because I think we should wrap this up. I'm happy if obviously people want to discuss other things afterwards, but just for the purpose of this call, which was to get everyone on the same page and what happens next. I think it was really great to actually see the work out of the team and come up with basically these ideas of how it could be factored. And I think basically we should go ahead with the small option, understanding that it is small. It's it's not necessarily what we're dreaming of, but it's going to flesh out a whole load of things, including a bit of the opportunity to build a community around it, which don't underestimate that. Makespace is all at some level working now, but it didn't exist because unless there was a whole bunch of people to actually make it happen. So I think that is actually quite critical. And personally, I'll be watching, just so you know, how well that team and whatever forms around it and makes it happen, right? Because that's going to be a good judgment of whether this is going to be successful if we did go bigger. So I understanding what the final equipment list is, what the costing would be, and this is assuming we can do some slight tweaks, understanding what yearly operational costs are going to be. This is not necessarily the materials cost and things like that. This is maintaining machines and things like that. So yes, we might purchase a machine, that's a capital expenditure, but there's to keep that machine running does cost money. In the case of this small one, it's not going to be very much, I can't imagine. In the case of if we've just bought a £40,000 fiber laser, you really do want to know, is it another £5,000 a year to keep this thing running or something like that? So I think it gets more critical for some of the bigger things. Coming up with the layout and storage plans, so we actually know where everything's going to go, and sort of that all makes sense, and people aren't going to be tripping over each other. And then actually knowing who is going to lead, like on the health and safety stuff, on the training stuff, and on the maintenance stuff. That's going to be really important, because that's the confidence it'll actually happen. And I think in terms of actually doing this small option, provisionally this is fine. The board's happy to sign it off and budget it and things like that. So in that sense, we're good to go. But I think this needs to be in place to actually start the purchases. And I mean, maybe the Bantam or something might be worth ordering now because of lead times and stuff like that, if that is the right part to go with and things like that.
From what I remember, they're still having problems shipping to the UK.
Right. And maybe therefore it's not quite the right thing. But I think the concept of what you were getting in the Bantam, maybe it is that one, and we just wait for it. Maybe there's something that's the equivalent. But from what I was getting from feedback, that was the opportunity, right?
I believe that one is US based. Nothing changes between the US and us by Brexit.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I suspect we're going to be more limited by the fact they're ramping up production and starting to get them out there. And for it's Bray and whatever behind it, isn't it? So it's a bit like when we got the first MakerBot, right? It's that sort of thing where in 5 years' time it probably isn't the ideal thing, but for now it might be the ideal thing. So Mark, I know you'd been helping coordinate the team, which was really useful from mine and Adrian's perspective. But I think you were saying that over the next 3 months you're going to be quite busy. I don't know if that's still what your thinking is.
Yeah, I guess there's a combination of things. One is I have a lot of work on at the moment. Like kind of surprising to me given the pandemic, but I'm very busy with work at the moment. But also, Hitchin Hackspace is in a very similar situation of trying to pull together tools we have the money, we have a space, we don't actually have that many tools in it, and I'm definitely going to be spending a lot more time in Hitchin Hackspace than Makespace in the next year, and I think driving this forward would be better with someone who knows the community better and is going to be more likely to spend time in the space. So if anyone else could help out there, that would be great.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's been very helpful to get at this point. This is excellent. I think effectively, we're looking to sign off on this small thing and go through and execute it. So I think it would be important. One of the important things is to make sure there are some people that really can help.
Well, I'm certainly interested in helping, but with my previous experience in metalwork, I found out that I was running the whole metalwork for the last 2 years on my own. So while I'll help, it must be with other people, though.
Yeah, exactly. It takes quite a mix of skills to get these things to work, and some of it is skills on the machines, some of it's understanding, some of it's social engineering. There's a whole mix. So it'd be really nice to see a group of people form that had that whole mix of skills that makes it happen. Yeah, because Alaric, I know exactly what you mean. You don't be too enthusiastic, otherwise you get to do it all. Okay, but does that hopefully that I mean the purpose of today was to bring everyone up to speed about where we are. I think certainly from my perspective, this is great to see. I'd love to see it happen. Like we should press go on the small stuff as soon as we can get our act together and see a plan for make it go. Personally, I'm going to be trying to work out how we could allocate more space over the next 6 months, such that we could do make the medium thing possible based on that space being available, and the small one obviously showing signs of success, that it is an area that people care about. So that's from my perspective. I guess what we need now is a bit of a reach out to perhaps the wider community who showed interest in metalwork in the first place, now that we've got this phase. And I've sort of tweaked the Metalwork group, the email group, to be this sort of club model that we're trying to give it a bit more focus and longevity after this has established itself. So it'd be really good to encourage anyone to join that email group and see if we can. I'll post the requirements on there again, but I think we need to find what is effectively the small group of people who's going to lead that, but also the wider skill set there. Is anyone on the call particularly nominating themselves?
I guess I will.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Alaric, that's great.
I'm going to lean on Alaric a lot, though.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, it's teamwork that does it. Okay, and I think maybe we've got something substantial enough that also we can reach out to some people that perhaps aren't members now, but would have a lot of the skills, perhaps that have, I don't know, worked in these sort of areas before. Alaric, you probably have a good idea of what you think there might be, the sort of skills that where we might find these people as well, if they're not already among us.
Then just to remind everybody that moving this forward, we do have to do things like health and safety, whatever. So we're going to need input from as many people who can as possible in that space.
Yeah, in some sense, this fourth bullet on this list is almost the most important, because certainly from the director's point of view, we're going to be looking at a group of people and saying, do we think this is going to happen and be successful? So the coherence of that team is really valuable, right? It's been, when big things have happened in Makespace, it's because there's been a coherent team around some people that are really driven to make it happen with good sense to make it happen. So we're in the nice position that we can sign off the budget for this, because it's, for the small one, it's not particularly big. For the larger ones, I'll probably go and help drive a sponsorship round with Marshalls or the Welding Institute or whoever it might be to help fund those sort of things. But for the small one, from the board's point of view, this is fine. This is great to see this happen. So I think it really is about the coherence of a team that's going to make it happen. Yeah, I think that's, for me, that's a really important thing. Anything from you, Adrian, that would be useful?
No, I think it's been a great exercise. Again, just to echo Mark and the folks you've worked with in the metalworking team. It's a great job pulling this information together. It's really good to see this. And I think we've regularly at board meetings said we need to find the next point to push Makespace for expansion, and this is one of those points. So yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah, all the spreadsheets and everything are linked off the drive that's off on that website. So if you join that group, you'll get access to all the spreadsheet and whatever that Mark pointed.
Yeah,
right.
a few people clicked earlier to try and get access, and I've given them permission. So if
well
anyone
done.
else asks, I'll just give permission now, or join the group.
So hopefully that's brought everyone up to speed. Feel free to drop off the call now. Don't feel obliged to stay any longer. But also, if anyone's got any particular questions or comments for the group, given that you're all on the call, yeah, please shout. But thanks everyone, and yeah, great to see all the effort. But let's make it happen now. It'll be excellent.
Great, thank you.
Right, yeah, thanks all. Cheers, Jonathan.
Thanks,
Thanks, and good night.